Welcome back to another episode of The Conscious Artist, a safe space for conversations around mental health awareness for musicians, artists, and all human beings. I am your host, Pallavi Mahidara. I'm a concert pianist and teacher, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are joining us today. My hope for this show is that it will give all of us a sense of solidarity and knowledge that we are not alone, and together, through these conversations, we can create more awareness and change for a healthier future. We are joined today by Dr. Emily Wong, a physician and brain coach. Dr. Wong is an affiliate associate professor with the University of Washington Medicine Department and is an honorary associate professor in the University of Hong Kong Li Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine. Her mission is to help women unleash the extraordinary power of their brains by combining the best of science and self-coaching. Dr. Wong has a blog called Integrity Healing, where she offers advice and tips on brain health coaching. Dr. Wong, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so excited to talk to you today. I feel that you can really provide some great insight for our listeners into learning better ways to engage our minds and to take care of our brains. And if you don't mind, could you tell our listeners a little bit about your work and how you became interested in pursuing the direction of physical health with wellness and conscious thought?
Sure. So, I've spent most of my career as a primary care physician, and most of it actually in academic medicine at the University of Washington in Seattle. I came back to Hong Kong about 10 years ago to actually take care of my grandmother, who at the time was 92. She's now 102. And
Wow.
she has been losing a little bit of her memory every year. And so, really, my idea initially coming back here was just to spend a little bit of time with her since she raised me. And I'm the only doctor in the family. I really wanted to spend some time with her and take care of her. And that's, been very successful in the sense that she's physically quite well. But I think that as I sort of taken care of her more, I've realized that there's only so much that we can really do as doctors. And as I sort of became more aware of our limitations as doctors, I really, over many years, have become more and more interested in integrative medicine. And what I love about many of the integrative medicine modalities is that they really give, I think, people more choice, more freedom, more autonomy, agency over their own health. And then as I sort of got more into integrative medicine, I realized that really the key aspects to health, and particularly brain health, are our daily habits. And they come down to the basics of sleep and exercise and nutrition. And so that's really how I came to coaching, because I feel like, aspirationally, we all understand the importance of those basics. But when it comes to sort of actually putting ourselves first, putting our self-care as a priority, I think that there's just a lot that gets in the way of that. And so that's kind of like how I got into the coaching part.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think that's so true that so many of us, in theory, recognize the benefits of sleeping, taking care of yourself, eating well, exercising. And then we all end up, prioritizing, well, I need to do my work, so I'll exercise tomorrow. Or I have to
Yeah,
finish this project, so I'll go to sleep later. And
yeah.
that kind of leads me to part of what I want to talk to you about today, and what I essentially about brain function and how not taking care of ourselves, not taking care of our
Mm-hmm,
bodies and our minds actually can lead to impaired cognitive function. And as
mm-hmm,
a musician, I definitely have noticed, for example, when I'm very tired, I have less control of my
mm-hmm,
fine motor skills, or
mm-hmm,
less control of my memory, even. Essentially,
mm-hmm,
my cognitive
mm-hmm,
functions are slightly impaired.
mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I would love to get your professional take on that. Maybe we can start with the topic of burnout, which is
Okay.
such a relevant topic to not only musicians and artists, but any field. And maybe if you could share a little bit about what burnout is, those of us who have experienced it, I think, would love to know how we got
Yeah.
there so we know how to avoid it next time.
So, burnout is really one of these terms that we hear so much these days, right? And really, what it boils down to is just being in this state of sort of long term stress, right? So, there's just this sort of chronic stress that kind of like wears us down day after day and week after week, month after month, year after year, right? And there's three components to it. The first one is this idea of emotional exhaustion. So, it's when you care about something for too long, right? And too much. And then there's depersonalization, which is really where you really lose this sense of empathy, compassion. You kind of like lose track of, just who you are, right? And then there's the lack of personal accomplishment. That's the third component. And that's just sort of like a sense of futility. No matter what I do, it doesn't matter. Nobody cares, right? So those were really the three main sort of like hallmarks, I would say. But overall, it's probably easiest just to think of it as being a sense of overwhelm, a sense of exhaustion, and just kind of like, I can't do this anymore.
That term, emotional exhaustion, is very interesting, and especially the way you describe it, because, for example, at least I can only speak for myself, but as an artist, as a musician, my work is my passion, and my passion is my work.
Mm-hmm.
I love what I
Mm-hmm.
do, and I know I'm so lucky that I get to do what I love every single day. But that doesn't mean that I don't get tired. That doesn't mean that sometimes it's too much, or maybe it's not piano itself or music itself, but it's the stress and the pressure around it. Is that sort of what you're alluding to?
Um, yeah, I would say that, each individual really kind of has to define for themselves because it is a subjective state, right? Like whether I feel burned out or not. But I would say that there is a very fine balance between sort of enough stress to where I'm feeling excited, where I feel challenged, right? Which is what I'm kind of hearing you say with music, right? There's a level at which you're kind of like, oh, this would be really fun to do this, concert or whatever it is, or this piece, right? Or maybe play with this group, right? But then there's a level at which, it's kind of like too much stress and you're just exhausted and you're like, "Ugh, another thing, right? Just maybe 50 other things, right? So I think for each individual, that's just going to be tuning back into their body, kind of listening to what's going on.
Okay. It sounds like it's a little bit more of needing to find a better balance, at least for myself,
Mm-hmm.
because I definitely have noticed in my life that I do these sort of extreme things, and I'm actively working every day to seek more balance in my work versus play. This concept of work hard, play hard. I have noticed in my life that I tend to work like crazy when I have concerts, and as always happens in life, everything happens at the same time. you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so
Yes.
I'll have four different programs or five different programs in a couple weeks or 1 month, and then I have an entire month break and I just stop, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like time freezes, and sometimes I won't even touch the piano for a week or two, which I know some musicians are going to be pulling their hair out at hearing that. But it's my way of dealing with the inordinate amount of stress that ends up accumulating over
Mm-hmm.
time. And I think it's because
Mm-hmm.
I haven't quite learned properly how to master dealing with stress on a regular basis, on a consistent basis. But
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about that, about stress in general, and what sort of leads us to come to a state of sort of extreme stress or prolonged stress, or I don't know if there's even a term of chronic stress. Why
Mm-hmm.
is it that we
Mm-hmm.
feel when we have so many things to do, stress is the inevitable state of mind that we
Yeah.
that we fall into?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just going to back up for a second here and just clarify that there's two kinds of stress, right?
Okay.
So there's kind of physical stress, and then there's emotional stress, right? So physical stress is like let's say you've traveled for, 18 hours. I know you guys travel a lot, and then you're jet lagged and you're sleep deprived. There's that kind of stress, right? Physical, stress. And then there's kind of more the emotional stress. And I think when we're talking about musicians, at least from what I understand from our prior conversation, there's kind of both going on. Right. So if you're traveling a lot and you're,
Absolutely.
sort of working a lot, then you may be sleep deprived. You may have that physical stress going on. And then you may also, and that's a chronic condition because you keep doing it at least, like you said, maybe for a whole month at a time or longer. Right. And then you have a period of rest. But then there's this, sort of emotional stress, which I will further break down into sort of optional stress, right? And non optional stress. So, performing at a high level, I would say there is sort of like, there's a level of stress that goes with the territory. So that's that sort of like challenging, like this is fun, this is exciting kind of like level of stress that I would, describe, maybe just my understanding for doctors, right? It's kind of like there's kind of a fun level of stress, and then there's kind of like the exhaustion kind of end of things, right, where there's just too much going on. And a lot of what I do in my coaching has to do with sort of the optional part of stress that I feel like we put on ourselves, right? So when we're
Definitely.
not achieving the thing, when we haven't put in enough time, when we aren't, for whatever reason, like we're just beating up on ourselves, right? Like that's what I would consider kind of the optional part of the stress that we are kind of really putting on ourselves.
That makes a lot of sense. And that I guess since I've started to become more in tune with my own needs and actually listening to my body, listening to my mind, listening to sort of what state I'm in emotionally, psychologically, physically, I'm starting to be more conscious of taking the breaks that I need more frequently rather than pushing myself to the limit and then crashing.
Mm-hmm.
But what about, for example, there are many artists that, not just musicians, but, all types of performing artists that travel, and give 1 or 200 concerts or shows a year, and they're basically on the road almost every day. But I wonder, how do we, for people that do, travel constantly, and it's not even actually just in performing arts. I mean, there, people
Right.
in even my father, who was in
Mm-hmm.
finance, used to travel almost every week at some point and long international trips.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal
Mm-hmm.
with sort of not getting into an autopilot mode with that and
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
consciously taking care of ourselves and our bodies and our minds and listening? If we have to do something and we really don't have a choice, how can we do it in the best way possible to benefit our bodies and our minds?
Yeah. So I love that you brought up this concept of autopilot because I really think that the answer to your question is actually to stay connected with the physical body. I think that when I think of that term autopilot, it's typically something that I associate with, like, I just can't even, you know, um, I don't have time to deal with these emotions that are coming up, for example, or I don't have the bandwidth. And so I'm just going to ignore the fact that I'm hungry, that I have to go to the bathroom, that I, need the sleep or whatever it is. And so I kind of become disconnected with my body. And I think there are a lot of professions and a lot of people who can kind of like go into what I call more of a dissociative state, meaning that they, separate their minds and their ability to work or do whatever it is they need to do from their bodies. And that's something that sometimes is really necessary. I mean, you think about like a firefighter, or any kind of first line responder, like in the moment, they can't just be like, oh, this poor child that was in a motor vehicle accident or whatever it is, they just have to be like, save the kid, do the whatever
Right.
you need to do, right? And set aside your emotions for the moment.
Is disassociation similar or different to depersonalization?
Different. Yeah,
Different.
different. Yeah. So depersonalization is more kind of like a sense of like where you don't have the empathy or compassion, um, even if you had the time,
Right. So
you wouldn't be able to, connect with that. But dissociation is, in my mind at least, more kind of like where you're not in touch with how your body physically feels rather than emotions per se. It's really more kind of like, because emotions are part of how our body feels, right? But if you're not even in tune with like your biological signals, your survival signals, like you have to eat now, you have to go to the bathroom now, or whatever it is, then I think that that's where, we're not necessarily like listening to our bodies need to rest now, our bodies need to sleep now, whatever it is. Yeah.
Okay.
So I do think that autopilot is a very difficult, state to kind of sustain over the short term. It's definitely, sometimes it's necessary. But to answer your question, I would say that it's really it's really kind of taking care of yourself to arrange your schedule in a way that you don't have that level of intensity, to where you kind of like are not able to take care of yourself or not able to stay in tune with your body. So I think it's really a matter of figuring out how to, sort of make those decisions ahead of time that will serve you, your future self, so to speak.
That makes a lot of sense. I started going to therapy a year and a half ago, and it completely changed everything in my life. I feel I feel like I was asleep for the first, well, until now,
Mm-hmm,
in my life,
mm-hmm,
in
mm-hmm,
terms of the way I lived and the decisions that I made and how I acted, because so much I feel was on autopilot, not
mm-hmm,
even realizing I was on autopilot. And it's funny that you also mentioned autopilot and got a little bit more in depth with that, because I think as musicians, as students, and perhaps this could be in any field, I'm not sure,
mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
as music students, very very often I am I am yelling at my kids to not yelling, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
constantly reminding them to be conscious when they're practicing,
Mhm,
because so often what happens is that they go into autopilot while practicing. And I definitely was guilty of practicing in this way when I was younger. And I've spent the
mm,
last 10, 15 years really learning how to essentially practice with my brain.
mm,
And I suppose that when we consciously use our brain, we're actually also training the brain muscles. It's like a muscle, right?
mhm,
We're
mhm,
essentially
yes.
training it as well. And well, this is a nice segue into my next question,
Mhm,
which
mhm,
is a little bit about modern day technology. I was
mhm,
reading in your blog, you talk about how modern day technology and our constant use of it can be a contributing factor to decreased memory skills. And,
mhm,
I remember growing up not using a calculator. I used to memorize multiplication tables, mostly because my
mhm.
grandfather was a math whiz and he used to love trying to like train us grandkids to follow in his
Yeah,
footsteps.
yeah.
But I also did Kumon for several years as a kid. Kumon is a Japanese English and
Mhm,
math
yes.
learning method.
Mhm. Tutoring, mhm,
Yes, and of course with memorizing music since I was 3, I was consistently training my brain. I used to read voraciously, and I honestly I prided myself in memorizing all of my friends' phone numbers and
mhm,
birthdays.
mhm,
While I continue to train my brain in my profession, I definitely feel, I mean, it could be with age also, but I definitely feel that with modern technology and the ease with which everything can be Googled or saved or looked up, my memory
mhm,
skills are decreasing. I definitely feel that.
mhm,
And
mhm,
I believe you said on your blog that our short-term memory pathways essentially they can atrophy due to underuse. And you mentioned that reading is one of the easiest and most important ways to train our brains. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connection with modern day technology and sort of this whole concept of just looking everything up, not really utilizing our brains to not even their maximum capacity, even like 10%.
Right, right, yeah. So these concepts actually come from the brain and memory coach. His name is Jim Quick, Kwik, and he's a memory coach and a speed reading coach, and so he came up with these terms. So one of them's like digital dementia, and digital dementia is where we always look things up on our phone these days, and you don't have to remember anything, whether it's a phone number or whether it's some fact or whatever it is, right? And so the other thing he talks about is digital deluge, which is where we're constantly being inundated by, social media and emails and all the notifications from all the things, again, on your phone and your computer. There's just an endless sort of like, it feels like a fire hose, right, coming at you all the time with all this information, right? And then he talks also about digital distraction, right? Which is where even when you're engaged in work, whether it's, on your computer or on your phone or whatever it is, you're answering email, some other notification pops up. And so then you're going down this other rabbit hole, right? Of like doing this thing and the other thing. And so his point is that, we sort of as a maybe society have not really learned how to master like all of these inputs and really use them to our benefit. And so far, what they seem to be doing is just sort of we're kind of like running around following them, and so much of what's happening to our brains is that sort of like the neurons and the neural pathways that are so important to forming memories, to helping us train our memories. As you say, the brain can be like a muscle. The more that we strengthen that muscle, the better and stronger our memories are. And yet we're constantly sort of like now, oh, I'm just going to look it up. I don't have to remember anything. And so, we kind of are losing that skill. And the way that he talks about it, it's kind of like, before there were elevators, we always took the stairs. Right. And
Definitely.
before there were cars, we would walk everywhere. And so it's like the modern conveniences have led us to basically become lazier, and then those muscles, we lose the use of them. And now we're spending 8 or 10 hours a day, like sitting at a computer or sitting at whatever. And so you know, that's a problem. That's a problem for our whole bodies and our systems.
You do touch upon two topics I want to go more in depth on. One about distraction, digital distraction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
I have noticed that when I turn off my phone, which I
mm-hmm,
started doing only recently in the last couple months, I get much better practice done. I'm much more focused. And I noticed also that having my phone on all the time and feeling like I was constantly connected to other people
mm-hmm,
actually made me more disconnected to myself. It actually it actually led to more anxiety.
mm-hmm.
And so I started, I think this was months ago, maybe in the beginning of 2021, I actually turned off all notifications on my phone.
Great,
So,
great. Mm-hmm.
WhatsApp, Instagram, messages, whatever it is,
Yeah.
I turned off all notifications, which has been really great because this way I'm not constantly distracted by
Mm-hmm,
something pinging or
mm-hmm.
my phone lighting up.
Yeah.
Turning off my phone entirely really led to me recognizing that I wasn't connected enough with myself and that I
Mm-hmm,
wasn't
mm-hmm,
focusing inward. And I've
mm-hmm,
noticed that whenever I start to feel very, very anxious about anything, even if there's nothing to be anxious about, this anxiety starts to build. And I notice that the symptoms are that I start to mindlessly scroll or
mm-hmm,
open apps or
mm-hmm,
check my phone. And
mm-hmm,
that's the moment when
mm-hmm,
I say, okay, phone needs to go off now. It's been a really big learning process, and I've barely scratched 1% of I think where I can go with it, and
mm-hmm.
what I think we're all capable of. But
Yeah, yeah, you're
um,
describing something actually even that I haven't touched on, which is buffering. Buffering is like where we're distracting ourselves. We're intentionally distracting
mm,
ourselves, whether it's through, scrolling on social media, whether it's overworking. I mean, we sometimes like, numb out just overworking, right? And sometimes we overexercise or we eat or we drink or whatever it is, right? And so there's a lot of that these days because we're really not used to being kind of alone in our own headspaces, right? But I love that you have talked about, like just turning off your phone. Like my daughter has shown me, she's a writer, and she has shown me how powerful that is, right? Just to
wow,
actually be able to turn off your phone. And, she's 25, so she's in a generation that, more or less are digital natives, right? She didn't grow up with a smartphone, but she's had one, since high school. And so I do feel like that's a generation that's beginning to learn. Like, this is how we kind of like take back our control maybe over some of the technology. And, so we turn off our phones at dinner. We turn off our phones, when we're doing some focused creative work.
I love that. It's a little bit
Yeah.
like we control the technology, we don't let it control us. Just like we need to learn how to
Mm,
control our minds and manage
mhm.
our minds, not let it control us, not the reverse.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. And then you also mentioned before, well, you talked about the first one, which was
Dementia,
digital
digital
dementia.
dementia.
Exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. And
Hmm.
I wanted to touch upon this concept and this idea that essentially we can just look up everything,
Hmm.
so we don't
Hmm.
need to
Hmm.
remember anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's definitely something we all experience, and I think the challenge to ourselves is really how do we really proactively basically take back some of that, right, capacity in our memory. So what I would equate it to is, remember how I was talking about like how we spend like 8 or 9 hours sitting at a desk these days, and so you've probably heard this term that sitting is the new smoking, right?
I
Which
actually
isn't
haven't.
which isn't strictly accurate, but it's on some British like public health, CSA, like But I wouldn't necessarily like equate sitting to cancer per se. But I what I would say is that it certainly is something that is not good for our bodies. And so what we're learning now is if we can, kind of chunk up the day so that you're spending like maybe anywhere from 25 minutes if you believe in the Pomodoro method of focus, or all the way maybe up to 45 to 50 minutes. It's different for everyone. But basically, spending a period of time where you're working and then getting up and taking a break for 5 or 10 minutes. Do a little stretch break. It might be a bio break. It might be to go get water or whatever it is. But the idea is that you don't just sit continuously for the entire time, right? And the way that I would apply that to this same idea of like sort of training our so that's kind of training our bodies in little bits rather than like spending 1 hour at the gym or 45 minutes at the gym. We're spending 5 to 10 minutes throughout the day, several times, basically moving our bodies, right? And so, by the same token, like you can build in little habits like that for yourself with your memory as well. And I do encourage people to, like, I actually have my credit card information memorized, and
Me
I find
too.
that super helpful. Yeah, because like when you go online, I mean, they're always asking you for this information. You're always digging around for your card somewhere. And when you
Yeah,
have that, it's super helpful, right? And definitely
definitely.
memorize the phone numbers of your loved ones, because if you ever do lose your phone, how are you going to call them if you don't remember their numbers, right? So,
Definitely.
I mean, I do sort of like encourage people to kind of train their memories and just test them, like try and build that capacity for yourself a couple times, 3 times a day, just kind of like just find things that would be useful to you, and test yourself, and memorize things.
That makes a lot of sense. No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I want to backtrack to what you were saying earlier about not sitting down for hours in a row, but maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 45
Mm-hmm,
minutes, even an
mm-hmm,
hour at most.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And this is something that we talk about a lot in the music world. As musicians and as performers, it's also physically not healthy for us to be sitting
mm-hmm.
at the piano or holding
Yeah,
up our violin or holding up
yeah.
our flute or whatever it is. And some of the wind
Mm-hmm.
players or the brass players cannot
Mm,
go for more than a certain amount of time because it's
right.
too much strain on their lip muscles and on their mouth
Mm-hmm,
muscles. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. I've definitely noticed when I'm more relaxed, when I'm, less stressed, I'm able to actively and consciously manage my time better,
mm-hmm,
and I'm more kind with myself. I am willing to
mm-hmm,
say, okay, I'm going to sit for half an hour or 45 minutes or an hour, or I'm going to work on this piece. Then I'm going to take a break, have my tea, go for a walk, just drink some water, have a snack, whatever it is. But
mm-hmm,
very often I notice when it's crunch time, a couple days before the concert, day before the concert, or maybe I'm, somewhere and trying out the piano, it's my rehearsal time. And, as
mm-hmm.
pianists, we're always playing on different pianos. So part of
Right.
the performance is also actually learning a new instrument each time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe let's say I only have 3 hours
Mm-hmm,
to practice, try out the piano, do the sound check, do the
mm-hmm,
lighting check, everything,
mm-hmm,
3 or 4 hours. And I've got, an 80, 90 minute program.
Hmm. Hmm.
I will sit. I will sit for 3 hours and I won't even notice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure that's not very healthy, but sometimes we don't have more time. So when we're
Hmm.
in those kind of situations where we actually don't have the flexibility and the luxury of taking those frequent breaks, and we really have a very limited amount of time to do what we need to do,
Hmm.
what are some tips that you could offer us? You have to do what you have to do,
Yeah.
but how can we do it in the best way?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to challenge you, push back a little bit on what you're saying, with the
Okay.
3 hours, because even if you have 3 hours, my guess is you probably are going to take a bathroom break in the middle there.
Maybe.
Sometimes not, sometimes not.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, okay, so even if you don't go and take a bathroom break, I would say it's worth taking probably at least a 2-minute break, let's say,
Yeah.
at the end of every hour.
I'm sure I do that. I'm sure I get up and
Have
stretch,
a drink of
have a
water.
drink of
Yeah,
water. I'm sure I do that,
yeah,
but I feel like I sort of allow myself to push myself to the limit because I'm like, oh
yeah.
well, I only have these couple hours and then I can go and rest.
So what I would encourage you to do, and we do this, so I coach, women doctors, and I would encourage you because, oftentimes what we encourage women, for example, surgeons, like before going into an operation, right, is to kind of build in a bit of a ritual for themselves. And athletes do this all the time, right? So kind of like build in a bit of a ritual for themselves, whether it's for this kind of like very intense practice that you have to do, like when you're getting used to this new instrument, or even like right before the performance, right? And so that may be a very short, like 30-second breathing exercise. So I don't know if you've heard of, for example, the 4-7-8 breathing, or even just, alternating nostrils, just you're basically training your brain to be like, okay, now is our time that we're going to focus. Now is the time we need to be calm in our brains, right? Because it's showtime, right? And we don't have a lot of time to like, go and do whatever it is to kind of like get the jitters out, right? But this is a time when I'm going to actually kind of go deep and reach for that, that resource within me that is, what my music is about, right? So it's something that you kind of have to do consistently. And I don't know if you've heard of James Clear. So he's the author of this book, Atomic Habits.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
yeah, so he is just amazing at sort of talking about how when we have a system in place, that's what allows us to perform with the kind of freedom and the kind of, I'm going to just say, artistry that we really are striving for, right? And it's not when we're sort of like pushing ourselves and whipping ourselves and trying to like, just really be hardcore about it, right? It's really actually just allowing ourselves to be consistent, be calm, because this is a habit. This is something we're doing all the time, right? This is a ritual. This is a protocol that I go through. That's the kind of way to really help your body feel safe. Because when we talk about stress, it's really a sense of fear. Like there's some threat, right? And so really your body will respond with these stress hormones, right? And if we think about what hormones are, they're kind of like these chemicals that are just in our bodies, and our bodies will automatically dissipate those chemicals, but they'll come up again if we continually have these thoughts that we're still under threat. It's still like, oh, everyone's going to see, everyone's going to, this fear, like I'm going to make a mistake or whatever it is, right? And so if we can allow ourselves to go into this state where we're just like, we're going to be able to handle whatever comes up, right? We're going to get into our ritual, get into our routine. Everything's fine, everything's safe. There's no saber-toothed tiger here. It's all good. Yeah, so it's really kind of like helping ourselves with our mind, right, to calm down kind of like the physical reaction. Yeah.
I love that you mentioned fear and rituals because I think the two can go hand in hand in terms of
Hmm.
finding rituals that work for you to help counter the fear. Or at least that's what I've noticed with myself. I do have a sort of concert day pre-concert ritual, which includes doing my practice in the morning But after that, I have my lunch and I take at
Mhm.
least a 1 hour nap, 1 to 2 hours.
Mhm.
I have my
It's
shower,
great.
I do my hair, my makeup, I get dressed.
Mhm.
I have to eat dinner, like a full
Mhm. Mhm.
dinner before I play. Because
Mhm.
for me, if I don't eat, I get low blood sugar and then I get really nervous. So I
Mhm.
know some people laugh. They just laugh at how much I eat before I play and then I go out for dinner
Yeah.
again after. But that's what I
Yeah.
need. And what
Yeah.
I've noticed is that I don't need to warm up before the concert.
Mhm.
If I don't warm
Mhm.
up, I mean, to be honest, most of the times I don't warm up at all, even if I can, but I
Mhm.
need a nap and I need to eat.
Mm.
Those are the two things that are
That's
crucial
great
for
that you
me.
know those things about you. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
taken
You
many
need to
years
have
to
a full
develop.
meal. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's hard because
That
sometimes if I don't, easily find, and I generally will target foods like some protein, some carbs, some long-term
Mhm.
energy, some short-term energy. And I find that if I, don't have a chance to take a nap, or I don't end up finding the food that I normally like to eat,
Mhm.
that does cause more stress. I've noticed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really great example of where you actually have total control over your protocol, right? So you don't necessarily like, even if the food isn't right, like if you have like, let's say you do six different things, right? You take your nap, you have your meal, right? And, you have like all these things that you do. Like I would just encourage you to try and engage your senses, right? You're a musician. Do
Mm.
you listen to some music? Do you listen to maybe a meditation or something like that ahead of time, right? I have a sense, I would guess that probably the auditory piece is really important, right? But also our olfactory senses, so our sense of smell. Like, is there an essential oil that you would,
Mm.
consider using during your practice? Just for fun, just to try it out.
I
Maybe
love
it's
that.
lemongrass, maybe it's lavender, maybe it's
Lavender.
something like that.
100%
And
lavender.
then, yeah, yeah. So if you try that and then you're doing it while you're practicing, then you kind of like, you can evoke that sense of calm when I'm practicing, like by bringing that smell up. Because smell is such an important link, right, with our memory and our brain and sort of our mood.
I love that. I've never thought of that before. I'm going to keep some lavender essential oil next to the piano. No, that's really great because you're right that the whole reason I sort of trained myself out of needing to warm up before a concert was because
Mhm.
many times there isn't a piano to warm up
Mhm.
on. And when I
Mhm.
was younger, it would stress me out so much that, oh my goodness, my
Mhm.
fingers are cold. I don't have a piano.
Mhm.
I'm going to play terribly.
Mhm.
And instead, I retrained my brain, I guess you could say, to
Mhm.
feel that, okay, no, I don't need a piano. What I do need to
Mhm.
do is make sure that my muscles are warm. Taking a hot
Mhm.
shower helps, and
Mhm.
stretching my fingers, my wrists, my
Mhm.
arms, my body, that helps.
Mhm.
That helps to get me
Okay.
warm and feel flexible. But for
Mm.
example, I think I do sometimes rely a lot on the food and the sleep aspect, a little bit like
Mhm.
a crutch.
Mhm.
Okay, there's also physiological benefits to sleeping and eating, so
Mhm.
I know
Mhm.
it's not
Yeah.
entirely in my
Yeah.
head, but
Yeah.
I love this suggestion of yours. An essential oil, or if
Mhm.
there's a meditation or something,
Mhm.
or just a
Mhm.
reminder to
Mhm.
sit and do a breathing exercise.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I definitely wouldn't think of them as a crutch. I mean, I definitely would think of them more as, this idea of the ritual, because we are, ritualistic, you know, people, right? Like just humans in general, right? And we are biological, animals. And if you think about, like, for example, a child going to bed, right? There is a bath, there's a story, there's, time with, mom or dad. And so, there's definitely sort of like something very soothing and calming about sort of a routine, right? That is very helpful. And I don't see those as a crutch at all. And athletes do this all the time. Michael Phelps, he has to be listening to this particular music. He's visualized exactly how that race is going to go, how many strokes it's going to be before he does the turn, before he comes back, what his time's going to be when he looks up at the clock. Like he has pre-visualized the whole thing.
Yeah, no, no, that's true. I guess we are creatures of habit.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
suppose I suppose
ultimately.
it's also learning to be adaptable and
Mm-hmm,
flexible,
mm-hmm,
um,
mm-hmm.
in the face of change in different circumstances. Um,
Right.
I want to ask you one last question before we end
Sure.
today. You have been, doing this sort of brain coaching for a while now, and I know that you talk a lot about fighting dementia, momming your brain,
Hmm.
taming
Hmm.
stress. What is maybe one piece of advice that you could offer to our listeners, musicians, artists, non-musicians, non-artists, to, as you say, mom your brain?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess my latest bent has been very much sort of just helping people see that really consistency is more important than intensity, right? So when we talk about self care, when we talk about brain care, right, we're really talking about things that we all know are how we take care of ourselves. So it's basically, allowing enough time for sleep, you know, really feeding our bodies good nutrition, moving our bodies, like those are the basics, right? And it sometimes can feel a little bit overwhelming when you look at like all the technology that's out there for tracking sleep and tracking exercise and all the things that you can do, right? And so what I really encourage people to do is just don't get caught up in the complexity, right? Just it's the idea of shifting your identity from someone who doesn't take care of themselves or doesn't prioritize self-care to someone who does, right?
I love
And
that.
it's not something that is going to happen overnight, right? But as James Clear says, every time that you follow through on any given habit, whether it's going to bed at a certain time, eating a certain way, right, then you're casting a vote for the identity of the person that you want to be. And really, the more that we can take care of ourselves, the better we will be at whatever we do. And so it's really not, having to do everything. It's not having to do, one thing like with a huge amount of intensity. It's just showing up for yourself.
I love that. Casting a vote for the kind of person you want to be. I'm going to remember that.
Yeah.
No, and consistency is key. I definitely tell my students that. I, try to remind myself of that, but I think I could be a much better student myself. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
consistency is key. Thank you.
I just want to say that I love that you are role modeling, not only for your students, but for your audience, the kind of musician who, really is at the top of her game and also, is, as you say, like a conscious artist, like someone who is aware of what it takes to really have this be a sustainable, right, career for people, for people to have good mental health and be taking care of themselves while also, bringing so much joy to people when they perform.
Thank you so much. I'm
Yeah,
trying my best,
yeah,
little by
yeah.
little. It's funny in the music world as an artist, as a not just music, as an artist,
Hmm.
we are aware that it is an always evolving, never ending, always
Hmm.
growing process.
Hmm.
We never feel that a piece is finished or performance is
Hmm.
perfect, but not
Hmm.
in a negative way. We just know that there's always something more to learn. And sometimes I feel like at least I should say I have definitely forgotten that as a human being, it's the same thing.
It's the
It's,
same thing.
we're always evolving,
Yes.
always growing, and it's not a bad thing. It's a great thing.
Hmm.
We're never going to
Hmm.
be a quote unquote perfect version of ourselves because there's always something more to learn. And how beautiful is that we can keep
Right,
evolving and keep growing and keep learning and yeah, just improve.
right, right. Yeah, that actually makes it more exciting, right? Because if
Definitely.
we were done, how boring would that be?
I mean, life would be all the same. And that's the thing. No two
Yeah.
performances are ever the same. The way I play today the way I play something today is maybe very different from how I played it yesterday or in a week or in a year. And it's the same thing with us as human beings. How we feel today, maybe we feel similarly, but there's some percentage that's different from yesterday and from 5 minutes ago and 5 years from now. And so I
Right.
suppose to remember that and view it as a positive thing and view it as, a beautiful and evolving aspect of ourselves and of our lives makes life more interesting and gives a
Hmm.
gives us more
Hmm.
color.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
You're so welcome. It's been my absolute pleasure.
Thank you all so much for listening. I am truly grateful for the support from each and every one of you. If you would like to submit any questions or topics for us to address on the show, you can send us a message on our Instagram page at Conscious Artist Podcast. Help us to spread more awareness by sharing this episode with your friends, your colleagues, your teachers, and your students. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sending you all so much love and strength, and we will see you next time for another episode of The Conscious Artist.